Thank you all for coming out. It's a thrill to be here with these two wonderful writers, and on your publication week, no less. We're honored to have you both here. I want to say that this event is sponsored by the Environmental Studies program at Tulane, and thank you to Environmental Studies students. I see you. I see you. For coming out. Environmental Studies is, I will say, one of, if not the fastest growing major at Tulane, and it will continue to offer more robust course offerings in the semesters ahead. Environmental Studies, not to be confused with environmental science, although students can take environmental science courses, is an interdisciplinary humanities and social sciences discipline that explores the relationship between the human and the non-human world. So majors can take courses in political science, English, history, sociology, economics, public health, and the arts. And I'm excited today because these are two writers whose work exemplifies the kind of approach taken by the Environmental Studies program here. They're writers who explore the relationship between people and the environment, between people in the world, and ask difficult questions about our place in the world, and the past, the present, and the future. And the title of this conversation was inspired by a question that I find myself getting almost every time I speak about climate change, and which is some version of, it's typically from a younger person, and it's some version of, knowing what we know about the climate, about the trajectory we're on. Is it ethical to have children? Is it ethical to bring children into the world? And sometimes this is asked by an older person, a sort of would-be grandparent about their adult child who's maybe has some reluctance. Often it's someone in their 20s or 30s. And without opining on my own answer to that question, my two sons are actually in attendance back there. They'll give you some sense of my answer. But it occurs to me, after receiving some version of this question over and over again, that this feels like a proxy for a much broader set of questions that essentially ask about the personal implications of climate change. What does this mean? What is this vast public crisis? How does it touch our personal lives, our inner lives, our daily lives? And so, Emily, I was hoping we could begin with you. And in your book, you write a lot around these kinds of themes, although this particular question you address, you say something like, it's pointless to question whether or not it was ethical to have your two sons in the first place, since in any case, they're here. But yet I wondered if you might be able to speak in the reporting you've done and in your thinking about your own life and your family, how you see this question. Do you feel like, that this, are there other versions of this question that you've encountered, and how do you think about this?
Yeah, my boys are 10 and... No, one of them just turned 11 and 12, so they're a little bit older than yours, Nathaniel. And, the first one was born in 2011, and the other one a little under 2 years later. So they had back-to-back kids, but it was before I had really an awakening or consciousness of the climate crisis in terms of its severity. So for me, that personal, very deeply personal question of is it ethical, is it okay to have a child, wasn't one that was in my mind. But I want to validate how real that question is for people younger than myself now. I, as was mentioned, I'm a professor at the City College of New York, which is in Harlem. I teach a climate writing class, and for my writing students, this is a very real question, and one that they're trying to work out on the page and in community. There are a lot of writers. Mia Christ is one of them. She wrote a kind of seminal essay in the London Review of Books called "Is It Okay to Have a Child?" and she's developing it as a book. And there are a lot of books this season. There have been some roundups. My book just came out of my book with other books that are thinking through parenting during this era of climate catastrophe, that being a question that is very real. Not merely is it okay to have a child, but what does it mean to ethically parent? Whether or not we are biological parents, what do we owe the next generation? Thinking about generational justice, that question of children when the future seems so unstable, not only the future, the present seems so unstable, is one that's very real for a lot of people. And I also just want to say, this business of the personal carbon footprint was also cooked up by British Petroleum, like trying to put the onus of personal responsibility on us as individuals to think about, okay, well, if I fly less, or if I, recycle more, or then the biggest one we've been told is if you don't have a child, like the biggest thing you're contributing to this problem is having a child. Like that's the messaging young people have received. And so it's not only one that's coming up organically for people, it's one that's been planted in people's brains that I think distracts us from more important questions, which are, what do we owe to each other, whether or not we have biological children. This is a crisis of, the climate crisis is a crisis of communion with each other and with nature. In some ways, I think it's a valid question, but we need to be asking other questions alongside of it.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, Madeline, you at home on an unruly planet, you focus on, I think, a different dimension of this kind of conversation, which is the question of home. And what does home mean? And you have, Emily and I both in conversation independently were struck by a quote from Wendell Berry that you use, in which you're sort of referencing a tradition, I think, in the environmental writing canon of writers writing about rootedness in a place, often an unspectacular, ostensibly unspectacular place, commonplace, but finding beauty in a sort of deep immersion, deep reflection. I mean, I think of Aldo Leopold, Annie Dillard, up to the present. There are lots of examples, Drew Lanham. But I wondered if, and your sort of provocation to that is it possible anymore to have that kind of rooted connection to a place when everything is changing so quickly? And so I wondered if you could speak about how this question of, I guess, that is it possible, and how do you write about home in this in this place that we've reached?
Yeah. I think the other tradition that I thought a lot about as I was writing the book is a lot of indigenous ideas about reciprocity. So, in sort of contemporary American mainstream, say, economic thought, home is like a piece of real estate. But I think home, in a larger sense, is about our relationship with the world around us. Emily just talked about questions we need to ask about how we have community with nature and with each other. And I think that's what the idea of home is. Rootedness is becoming more difficult, and some of that is because we live in a very mobile society. I mean, I've lived in multiple places in my life, and I'm currently living in Massachusetts, although I'm normally based in Seattle. So, we're rooted to maybe more than one place, or we're present and we're engaged with more than one place. But I think the question of what does it mean to create a home, a place of safety, a place that supports us, a community that supports us, I think we still have to ask those questions, and those are the kinds of questions that lead to other kinds of solutions about resilience, about how we support ourselves and each other through disaster, about how we undertake big steps to transform our economies. And so I think home is about connecting the very personal individual space with the space of community, with the space of the ecosystems around us.
In both of your books, I mean, engage some very large ideas and questions, and are also comfortable with not answering every question, which I really admire. But I want to focus a bit on the storytelling, because I think that's another thing that really distinguishes their books from so much of environmental writing, that there's a deep emphasis on stories. And so, Emily, in your case, well, you're sort of playing with form, but there's a lot of memoir, there's some reporting, and I wondered if you could describe some of the stories that were most exciting to you that you wrote about, and what more broadly do you see as the role of storytelling as a way into some of these larger ideas?
I think storytelling is really important when we're talking about messaging with the climate crisis beyond just the facts. It helps to have a human face, maybe thinking about the non-human world also. How this is affecting our lives. Being in New Orleans is reminding me that my first foray into environmental writing started because this is where my father's people are from, Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, not that far from here, for generations and generations lived there. And then after Katrina, because that was a ground zero of this event, they scattered, right? It's no longer the family seat in the same way that it was. And some folks went to Houston, and some folks in my family went to Atlanta. There's still a few folks there, but I began to be really curious about, I don't even think curious is the right word. I began to feel really compelled to write about the environment because of this event that had befallen my family. And so just thinking through even the subject of this panel, thinking about the climate change and family, this is something that's touching everybody in this room. And talking about it is really important, and why talking about it is important as a means of ending climate silence, which, as you may know, is the distance between the amount of us who are appropriately concerned and worried and the amount of us who talk about it with any degree of regularity is too wide. And why that's a problem is politically, we move the needle on policy when our policymakers understand what matters to us because we're loud about it. Who, for me as a writer, it began with Katrina, and then I live in New York City, and so between giving birth to one boy and the other, Hurricane Sandy happened and wreaked its havoc on that city, and I began to see that that home of mine, not just this home of the family seat of my father, was also imperiled by sea level rise in ways that I needed to pay attention to and write about as an essayist. And I, like you, Nathaniel, was a novelist before. I still write fiction, but it feels really important to me to tell stories about the climate crisis by focusing on, as Madeline has done in her book, in ways I really admire too, on the human stories and the human toll of people who've been living through events and working through them, and have actually, I think, stories about resilience that are worth paying attention to, whether or not they're known as climate experts or not. So I'll just conclude by saying one woman that I really enjoyed writing about for this new book lost her home in Hurricane Sandy in Staten Island. She lost everything. Unlike some people who owned their homes in Staten Island, she was a renter. She lived in the basement. So she couldn't build it back better or get, government funds to start her life. And what she did was she ended up moving into a van, which she named Langston Hughes. And some people would look at her and think of her as a homeless person, and that's not how she sees herself at all. She sees herself as somebody who has the gift of mobility to escape future disasters. She sees herself as somebody with deep knowledge of the crisis that we're in. She sees herself as somebody who understands the beauty and solace of nature, which she can spend more time in now that she lives in a van and can park in nature preserves and things like this. And somebody who understands that stuff doesn't matter. Stuff doesn't matter. She's living outside a kind of economic framework that a lot of us are trapped in, has a lot of wisdom about survival. And I profiled her in this book as an expert, even though some people would see her as invisible.
And Madeline, that reminds me of a couple of characters that you write about in your book who maybe are forced into the realization that stuff, against their will, that stuff doesn't matter. I mean, you write about people who their homes have been lost to wildfires. You write about people living on permafrost and their homes are literally cratering. And so I wanted you to maybe tell one of those stories, but also talk about, I think, a unique formal thing that you do, which I love, which is that, often when you're reading a journalistic account, especially around climate change, the reporter goes to some place, interviews the people, quotes them. This is what they say. These are the problems. These are what the experts say. And then there's sort of some first-person reflection on it. It tends to be the kind of convention. And you handle it in a sort of different, and I would argue more sophisticated and immersive way. And so I wondered if you could maybe use one of your stories and explain your approach to people who haven't read your work.
Yeah. One of the stories I was thinking about, both as Emily was just talking, but also as I was reading her book, I was thinking about how the value of focusing on very small, intimate details. Like early in your book, you have these stories about birds and bird paintings that you're observing. I was recently in a workshop with Jackie Bonazinski, who's sort of a narrative journalism guru sort of person, and she was talking about how the larger the topic you want to take on, in some ways, the narrower your gaze has to become.
Oh,
in terms
yes,
of
my students in the class.
Yeah.
Something I've been trying.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the story of Doria Robinson in Richmond, California. Richmond is alongside one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters on the West Coast, the Chevron refinery, a huge polluting facility that processes a lot of oil from Canada and from all over North America. And that community has borne the brunt of a huge amount of pollution and air quality impacts from that refinery, as well as there was a serious fire in 2012 that sent this massive plume of smoke up into the sky across the Bay Area and sent 15,000 people to local health clinics complaining of respiratory issues. Doria grew up in that community. She grew up in a historically black neighborhood. She left, and then because she felt like the place was kind of a lost cause, and then she came back because she had this pull toward longing for a sense of home and rootedness. And her way of thinking about how do we create a better community here was really small at the beginning. It was just to plant gardens and, to bring in clean soil in places in this industrial landscape, bring in clean soil, set up garden beds, plant kale, and then suddenly a community would show up and start getting involved in this because it was so beautiful. And there weren't that many beautiful things in this place. And out of that, over a period of more than a decade, and many other initiatives in this community, I mean, there's lots of fascinating creativity and activism in this place, has grown this much larger sense of what Richmond is and could become, and a much bigger conversation about, do we have the power and the right here to say, we would like this refinery to shut down, which is a huge question for a city, for any city, any community to start asking. And they're asking things like that in very real, powerful political ways. Doria got elected to city council more recently. So I think sometimes these little personal things become the space that helps gather us, the details that help us see something larger, and then through that, we sometimes come to much more powerful solutions than if we started, at this giant scale that seems too unwieldy for most of us to wrap our minds around.
And one thing I was struck by, Emily, in your book, there are a number of stories. I don't. How do you describe them as stories? Should I say stories or
Sure.
essays? I don't know. Narrative pieces where you go into some. So much of environmental writing seems to be shot through by this sort of sense of dread and anxiety, and then there's a sort of counter to that, which is but it's not too late if we act and do this thing. There are green shoots to. And I think you both do a really nice job of just avoiding that kind of dynamic, which can be extremely restrictive and narrowing. And what struck me about so many of your stories is that you might sort of hit on some of these ideas. You talk very soberly about the stakes and the science and the politics and all of the rest. But the emphasis, the tonal emphasis, often tends to fall on a moment of joy, an encounter in a playground between your son and a girl, on the sight of a bird. There's great stuff for people who are interested in birding and urban birding. I have a friend in New York who's an obsessive urban birder. She'll love your book. An owl, and or a mural, work of public art. There's a lot about public art work as drawing together a community and even a culture. And so I was curious to know how you think about that. Is that by design? What is the role of joy in all of this?
Yeah, I think the role of joy in thinking through this like large scale subjects, for me, the climate change is one of them, but we're living in what's been described as a poly-crisis era, right? So my book is also talking about social justice issues and racism, and I'm raising black children, black sons, and both of them have asthma because we live in the inner city in a community that's is a frontline community, sited near hazardous conditions. We're encircled by poverty and highways, and a third of the kids in our zip code have asthma. So I do want to name that indignation, dread, rage, fierce feelings of protection drive me in thinking through these large scale problems. But that's because I love them so much, right? It comes from family, which we're talking about today. I want them to thrive the way that any parent wants their kids to thrive, and I want our kids to be okay. And I'm not just talking about my kids, right? So when joy comes through in these essays or stories that the book is composed out of, it's because it's written from a place of love, under the umbrella of which joy is an animating force and feeling. And I was quite deliberate in writing these essays not to let the overriding feeling be indignation, despair, or dread, because I don't want to read that. In fact, I didn't even want my publisher to put climate change on the cover because it feels like vegetables or something like that. I quite deliberately hinged each of these essays. There's almost like a narrative maneuver, which I'll mention just because I know there's students in the room who are trying to figure out how to write about subjects as large as the environment, right? What does that mean? Well, environment, we all live in an environment. I grew up thinking environmental writing had to do with the wilderness or something, until this writer, Camille Dungy, opened my eyes by writing an essay that was terrific called "Isn't All Writing Environmental Writing?" And I thought, oh yeah, I'm a city dweller, so what? I live in an environment, and what are its elements that matter to me? Well, as a mother, the fact that the fact that we live near a bus depot and the George Washington Bridge, which is the most heavily trafficked bridge in the world, these are things I want to write about because they're affecting my children. And why is it that way? Why does the city look this way? But also, this is the place where we play and where we pray and where they're being schooled, not just by me. And I also want to pay attention to the fact in my writing that we experience joy and bliss. It's not just a hard story. And the last thing I'll say is when I first started writing deliberately about climate change, I felt very confused as a writer. Because things are so bad, I felt like, what place do I have to? It almost felt like to lie to be hopeful when you're really looking at the grim statistics. So I wrote to, this was shortly before he died, I wrote to Barry Lopez, and he wrote me back a letter that he'd typed, not an email. My question for him was something like, how do I write about climate change without being a doomsayer? Because I sensed that nobody would want to read, what was the point of that? And he actually didn't give me an answer, a clear one. He said I'd asked the right question. And he said, this is the struggle for any of us who are writing about this, is how do we be honest about the gravity of the situation while at the same time not writing in such a way that makes the reader feel like they're going to cave under the pressure of despair. And one thing we were talking about a little bit was emotion. Maybe that's a good segue into thinking through the myriad emotions we feel living in these uncertain times, and why it's important to pay attention not just to dread when we're talking about it, but also when we're writing about it.
Yeah, I mean, Madeline, this is something you wrestle with in your book as well. You have a quote, you have a line where you ask, how do you write a story about this era of disaster that doesn't end in tragedy? And I would turn that question back to you.
Yeah.
And I guess the other question is, why can't it end in tragedy? Why can't one write a tragedy?
Well, and I mean, I think it depends on how you define tragedy. I mean, to some degree, I did write tragedies in the sense that, I mean, a tragedy is about a flawed character, right, or a flawed place. And I mean, we live in a very flawed world in which we've already guaranteed a certain amount of climate impacts. I mean, there's a lot that's irreversible. I write about in St. Augustine, Florida, this moment when everybody's sitting in a conference with a oceanographer who trots out all of these facts about how basically we may have already guaranteed ourselves 20 feet of sea level rise, but I mean, before you all panic, not like even in the next century, but I mean, eventually it depends on what we choose as a society, how quickly, how much we can adapt. And that's a thing that, I mean, you're noticing that I'm having trouble saying it out loud, even though it's in my book. It's a difficult thing to swallow, and the whole room just went kind of silent, and then she made a joke like, well, call me Dr. Depressing or whatever you need to do to get through this. And then she went on to say, but here's what we can do to adapt. I think we all face this challenge of staring tragedy in the face and yet thinking, well, we can't just, I mean, I think for many people, it doesn't feel ethical to just say, well, I'm just gonna go party, we're done, or whatever. I think the people that I write about in the book find this space where, yes, they're looking the tragedy, the disaster, the frightening stuff in the face, but they're also doing everything that they can to find solutions wherever they can right in front of them. And that's the kind of hope and optimism that I think turns out to be most productive when you're thinking about climate change, is that there's still myriad opportunities to do things to make the world safer, to do things to protect the things that we love. Emily mentioned the word love a little bit ago. It turns out that love is one of the, when they do, the Yale University has recently done some research on what kinds of emotions and messaging motivate people on climate change, and they're coming back to the idea that love is actually the core emotion, that when we talk about the things that we love, the families that we love, the communities that we love, the places, the beautiful coastlines or prairies or wherever we happen to find that sense of home and love, when we talk to people about that is the thing that actually gets them to care about climate change and take it seriously. So, I mean, yeah, we live in this difficult space where the things that we love most are at risk, and I think it's in that action of trying to protect those things that we can find a sense of hope and joy.
We're going to open it up to questions in about 3 minutes. So there's a microphone there and one there. So if I encourage you to take the opportunity to ask questions of these writers, and while you're summoning your courage and your thoughts, Emily, I just wanted to build on Madeline's answer and some of the things that you've been saying about storytelling, and ask about. You alluded to certain conventions or associations we have culturally with environmental writing and environmentalism. And I wanted to ask you about how you choose subjects for your writing, because I think you seem to look for, often the subjects of your pieces don't match these sort of conventional cliched views of what an environmentalist should be, and yet through their work and through their action and through their passion, they reveal themselves to be very powerfully in this tradition. And I wondered if you could speak about how you think about which voices to elevate and how to do so.
Sure. I was asked to review a book for the New York Review of Books by Elizabeth Rush called Rising. Some of you may know it's about sea level rise and in particular the threat that it poses to the coastal United States. And when I read it, I couldn't help but think of my grandmother, whose name is Maybelle Sincere Raboteau, who I never met, although I share a birthday with her. She was pregnant with my dad when his father was lynched in the year 1943 in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And what she did, because of the threat of state-sanctioned terrorism under Jim Crow, was that she fled with my dad after he was born, when he was a little boy, along with his two older sisters. They landed in Michigan, where she survived or made a living by cleaning the homes of white people. And it was really important for me when I was talking about this book to also talk about my grandmother, because she, for me, was working in a tradition already, right, following the path of the Great Migration, working in community. Like, there was a path that had been forged for her to flee from terror. She ran from something that was threatening the people she loved, her family, because she wanted them to survive, and she was thinking of their futures. And she also was looking back. She understood resilience from people like Harriet Tubman, who knew what it was to try to seek liberation and freedom in the face of existential threat. And as Mary Anais Heglar, an essayist I deeply admire, has written, climate change ain't the first existential threat. In fact, it's insulting to people who have lived through and survived existential threats in the past. These are the people we should be looking to, I think. Both Madeline and I have also had the benefit of learning from people in the Arctic. I had the benefit of being able to talk to some elders from the Yupik community in Alakanuk, Alaska, in the Arctic, a ground zero of climate crisis where warming is happening almost faster than anywhere else on the planet. And when I asked one of these elders, an octogenarian, old enough to remember before the warming began, how did I pose my question to him? He had survived so much loss, right? He'd been to one of these state schools where they tried to kill the Indian and the child and cut off his hair and cut him off from his culture and make him lose his language. Like, he was at threat of death. And I asked him, what do we do with our anger? And his answer was so simple and would have sounded trite in almost anyone else's mouth, but it was, that's easy. We take care of each other.
You have a question there?
Hi, I am a teacher. I've taught elementary, I'm now in high school, and something that I've been struggling with how to have these conversations, because we're adults and we feel this existential panic and we can rationalize these things, but I've got, so many students who see what's going on in the world, they understand what's going on in the world, but they don't have any agency. They're at the center of these compounding crises, right? Economic, environmental, all of these things. They have environmental trauma from storms living here. Their families have environmental trauma. And so they don't have the agency they feel like to do much, to take any kind of stand. They're like, well, we've written letters and they don't get answered. That's what everybody always tells us to do. When we're talking about ethics, how do we have this conversation how do we help guide those, like, 8-year-old children who are like, well, what's the point? This isn't going to be here anyway. Like, they have, that's just like locked in their brain. Like, how do we have those conversations? How do you have those conversations with your children? Like, how do you lead them through all of that?
It's amazing that you're a teacher and that you're working through this with your students. I think it is our responsibility to show them that they do have agency by pointing to other young people who are working in our present very hard and quite successfully in some cases. For example, those kids in Montana in December sued the state and won for the right to have a future. Like, to tell them the stories of where the fight is happening successfully, like Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers, tell the stories of the helpers, and also affirm what they're saying. It's not going to be here anyway, right? We don't know when, but that's not wrong. Right? I think acknowledging fear and anxiety so that they don't think we're lying to them, right? And what do we do in the face of that? We have to look to the future and we have to look to the past. What have people done in the past? It's like my grandma. She knew to run. She knew in a certain circumstance she had to run, and she did, and it didn't kill her, right? So I guess how I talk about it with my boys is I'm really local about it. Who's fighting in this community for our environment? What are they doing? How can we help? How can we link to that? What are future possible careers in sustainability? That's their choice to make or not, but they should know there are jobs they can have. There are ways that they can work toward this, and there are people who are doing it already, and we need to tell those stories. And I think in terms of education, this needs to be part of our core curriculum.
I think I was just thinking of one other thing. I don't have kids, and but I was thinking about a line that I read in a book that's just out called Conceivable Future by Megan Kallman and Josephine Farrelly, where they talk about how, we're so often, especially in this country, women and people of color, asked to imagine violence against ourselves. We're asked to imagine our own doom. And they were saying that similarly with climate change, we're constantly asked to absorb these stories of doom, but we're not given the chance to imagine stories of creating, other kinds of possibilities, stories of creating healthier futures for ourselves. And there's the story that I tell of Richmond in the book in particular, but really all of the stories that I picked in the book are places where people have allowed themselves to imagine that it's possible to create a healthy community, or possible to, when necessary, relocate, but rebuild in a place where there's some kind of safer, more hopeful future for themselves. I think if we can allow ourselves to imagine that it is possible to create some of the things that are necessary, then I think that's really powerful. I think we don't give ourselves that space, and that's part of why we're not realizing some of these solutions quickly enough.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm a real meteorologist, okay? So you're not going to like this. But I do not have a rosy picture of the future. And a lot of meteorologists out there are starting to agree with me, okay? I think this is going to happen a lot quicker than any of you think. And I think it's going to get ugly. And to answer her question, I think you just got to face it and tell the truth. My boy's sitting right there, and I tell him all the time the truth of what's going to happen. Because as a meteorologist, I know what's going to happen. Okay? So as ugly as this is going to get as we sit here in the next mass extinction event, which is called the Anthropocene mass extinction event, which we have already begun. Okay? We're sitting here in it. What do you think about doing more active things like world policy? For instance, we're talking about families here. I think very firmly that there should be a world law that you should have one child. Because when you have two, you know you're contributing to the doubling effect.
We only have a few minutes, so if either of you want to respond to any of that, you're welcome to, and then we'll go quickly over there.
Yeah, I mean, which part of it should I respond to? I think in terms of the direness of it, yeah. I mean, we are facing impacts that are coming, all the time. The science is revising itself to show that things are happening more rapidly than was predicted. And I think we do have to be real about that. And so I'm not trying to tell stories that pretend that isn't happening, but just that, I mean, I think we still have to create space for possibility. The population question is a much bigger, I mean, we could have spent a whole hour on that, and I feel like it's also not quite at the center of my expertise, but I will say that I have written about some of the groups that are working on this, and what they find is that the most effective way to get people to consider the kinds of families and family size that they might have is to empower women to have more choices. And as a country, we're not empowering women and people with uteruses to have those kinds of choices. So I think that's, to me, that's the conversation that we need to be having.
I think very briefly, we have time for one more question over here.
Thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to have you all here. I want to ask if you all consider your writing work as an act of advocacy, and that goes to Professor Rich as well. And how much of importance do you think writing or author has in advocacy in general, not just climate advocacy, and how that importance might shift in the future?
Good question.
I do think of writing about this as an act of advocacy, in particular because I've been so educated by other writers that have opened my eyes. And I'm still learning. We're living, we're breathing this crisis. And so I just will say I've been very motivated by intersectional environmentalist Leah Thomas, who says, she has a great TED Talk where she says, what can we do? And she encourages people to consider what they're good at, what needs to be done, and what brings them joy. For me personally, I'm good at writing. What brings me joy is my children. What needs to be done is being honest about this, as the meteorologist has said. And I think being honest is also an act of love.
I think that's a good place to end. Thank you all. Join me in thanking these wonderful writers for being here today.